Hello everyone, I am Frightening Findings. We are back with more 3 true scary Reddit stories. And in this one, we have a Ouija board story, a classic. And remember to give that like button a frightening experience. Now let's get into these stories. I had some other odd experiences when I was quite young, and my family described strange things happening during that time too. However, I was too young to trust my memories, so I often chalked them up to memory distortion. This particular incident, though, occurred when I was 18. It happened in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, a small town just outside Tulsa. I was staying at my grandparents' house, and my cousins were visiting. There was a storm in the distance, but it wasn't raining where we were, so my cousin, brother, and I went outside to watch the lightning. My cousin had previously described numerous strange paranormal occurrences he'd witnessed, and during this visit, he was talking about seeing ghosts in the periphery of his vision. He even claimed that others who spent time with him also saw them, although he said some of them were being scaredy cats about it. Back then, he wasn't a very nice person. We sat on a brick wall, watching the distant lightning while my cousin continued describing these apparitions. Honestly, I didn't believe him at the time, and I'm still unsure if I do now. At one point, he suddenly freaked out, claiming he saw what appeared to be a little girl. He said it was the creepiest one he'd seen yet. At that moment, I started feeling unnerved, though I wasn't sure why. Even though I still didn't fully believe him, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I began nervously glancing over my shoulder, and that's when the incident started. I turned around and saw the figure of a small girl dart behind the air conditioning unit on the side of the house. I'm not sure what prompted this, but all 3 of us immediately felt the urge to get up and run, without discussing it. In the back of my mind, I thought it might have been my younger cousin, as she often followed us around, but the urgency to run persisted. Then things got even weirder. My brother stopped next to the air conditioner, looked behind it where I had seen the figure, and screamed. At first, I thought maybe he was messing with our younger cousin, but when I ran by, there was nobody there. We all bolted into the house. My brother and cousin ran to a bedroom in the back of the house, while I stayed up front, trying to process what I had seen. Eventually, I went to talk to them about it, but they were just sitting on the bed. My cousin laughed and said, "Oh yep, look, he's scared." He was a bit of a bully toward me back then. When I asked them about the incident, they both denied seeing anything and couldn't explain why we had all run. It was as if none of it ever had happened for them. Over the years, I brought it up with my brother several times, but he doesn't recall screaming or even much of the actual event. Aside from us watching the storm and our cousin talking about ghosts. I asked my brother about it again a few days ago, and he still doesn't remember the creepy feeling or his own scream behind the air conditioner. Unfortunately, my cousin passed away about 8 years ago, and I never brought it up with him, despite growing closer to him in the years before he died. That's my one unexplainable story. It still creeps me out whenever I think about it. My cousin seemed to attract strange happenings, as he had numerous paranormal stories, some of which I've confirmed with other people who were with him during those events. He moved around a lot, and some of the houses he lived in were straight up creepy. In that area alone, he lived in 6 different houses. I'm still not sure what the heck happened that night. I know this isn't as spectacular as some of the stories you'll find in the subreddit, but it still gives me chills, and I hope someone enjoys reading about it. I've written this in a more eerie style, but I swear it's all true. My teenage years were interesting, to say the least. Honestly, I've got more stories like this one. Back then, I had a big group of friends. We all went to school together until I moved away when I was 7. But by the time I was 11, we reconnected and grew close again. I'll be honest, we were little hellraisers. We all had rough home lives and needed some kind of escape. By age 11, alcohol and other stuff had entered the picture, so you can imagine the chaos. One friend I was particularly close to, we'll call him R, lived alone most of the time. His brother was his legal guardian, but he was never around for long. So, R basically had the house to himself. R's brother had gotten a girl pregnant, and the baby was born with multiple physical disabilities. Frankly, you wouldn't trust his brother with a pet stick insect, let alone a baby. The mother didn't want anything to do with her. One day, a few weeks after the baby was born, the mom showed up with the baby and a pile of baby stuff. She handed the baby over and never came back. From that moment, R took care of her. The baby had almost complete hearing loss in both ears, so R and all of her friends learned sign language. I already knew it. She became the center of our world. We referred to her as R's sister, even though she wasn't. There was always someone around to take her to appointments, pick her up from school, or play with her. Because of her, R's house became our main hangout spot. We lived in a rough area with a high crime rate, and R's neighborhood was especially bad. One day, I was walking to R's house when I noticed a man. He looked about 35, disheveled, and agitated. Typical for the area, so I didn't think much of it. By the time I reached R's door, he was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I brushed it off and went inside. Later that day, a group of us were hanging out at R's place when another friend shouted, "Take a look at this nitty," British slang for an addict. We all crowded around the window and saw the same man I noticed earlier. He was standing across the street, staring directly at us. None of us recognized him, so we were pretty sure he didn't live nearby. We laughed it off and went back to our conversation. That night, just before bed, we were still talking about the man and decided to double check all the locks just in case. At around 4 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of R's sister crying. After settling her down, I went downstairs for a glass of water. It was still dark outside. The stairs in R's house are immediately to the right as you enter the front door, which had frosted glass panels on the top half. As I sleepily made my way down the stairs, I didn't notice the outline of a face pressed against the glass until I reached the bottom. It was the same man, his face shoved up against the frosted glass, staring right at me. I jumped, then reacted without thinking. I ran up to the door, pounded on it as hard as I could, and shouted at him. He bolted, and I immediately double-checked the lock. By then, everyone else had rushed halfway down the stairs, asking what had happened. I told them what I saw, and we all exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone went back to bed except for R and another friend, who decided to sleep in his sister's room, just in case. I, on the other hand, couldn't sleep, and started cleaning the house out of sheer anxiety. I had this gut feeling that the man would come back. Our house had a garden with 2 glass doors looking out onto it from the living room. The curtains were broken, so nothing covered them. After a trip to the bathroom, I started getting that creepy feeling again, like someone was watching me. I hated those glass doors at night. You couldn't see anything outside. But I told myself I was just being paranoid. I kept glancing at the doors, jumping at every movement, even birds on the fence. Then, as I turned to switch off the light, I noticed a small glow in the back of the garden. I had no idea what it was, so I pretended I hadn't seen it and headed upstairs to the bathroom. The bathroom window looked right over the garden, and it was slightly ajar. Without turning on the light, I balanced on the toilet and sink, peering out. I audibly gasped when I saw him, the same man, sitting at the back of the garden in an old chair, smoking a cigarette. He'd probably been there the entire time I was cleaning. This wasn't the kind of area where you'd go out and confront someone. Knives, machetes, and guns were all common. His baggy clothes meant I couldn't tell if he was armed. Calling the police was a last resort because, well, explaining why a group of teens and a little girl were alone in the house wasn't going to end well for us. I jumped down, trying to figure out what to do. I woke my friends and told them what was happening. We checked, and sure enough, the man was still there. We decided to take our sister to someone else's house just to be safe. For the next 4 days, we all stayed at ours while our sister stayed over at another friend's place. Those next 4 days were some of the strangest in my life. At first light, the man was still in the garden. We figured he was just another drugged up local who would be easily scared off. R, having grown up in the area, had more than one weapon. Armed with bats and kitchen knives, we gathered in the living room. In the daylight, we could see the man more clearly. There were about 15 of us. Most of the girls were punks or grunge, and the guys were all roadmen, decked out in tracksuits and balaclavas. We'd all been in enough fights to know how to handle ourselves, and we definitely looked the part. As we stared him down, he panicked and bolted, nearly knocking the fence over as he scrambled to escape. But later that day, I heard a noise at the front of the house. Something like someone knocking over the bins. Fearing it was just foxes, I checked the window and saw the same disheveled man. This time, he had 2 other equally ragged-looking men with him. We made eye contact, and that's when I got a proper look at him. He was in his mid-30s, dressed in filthy, baggy clothes, with greasy brown hair and dirt-stained hands. He smiled, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't before. He had a Glasgow smile. It felt like something straight out of a horror movie. I called out to my friends that he was back. One of them suggested we go confront the men, but that idea was quickly shut down. We could fight, but none of us were bulletproof. We weren't about to risk running into someone who could actually shoot at us. We shouted at them to leave, and to our surprise, they did. At least, for a little while. A few hours later, a friend went down to get some food and saw the man and one of his minions back in the garden. She rushed back to warn us. As we hurried down the stairs, we were startled to see the other minion with his face pressed against the front door. At this point, we were out of ideas. Still not wanting to call the police, we decided to just watch them. For 4 days, we took turns keeping watch, We slept in shifts, with the bats and knives always close by. The men didn't leave either. Every now and then, one of them would press his face against the glass or bang on the door, making strange noises. We'd jump up and bang back on the door until they stopped. A couple of times, we boiled water, sneaked it upstairs, and poured it out of the bathroom window onto the men below. They would jump back and swear at us, but they still wouldn't leave. They stayed, sometimes disappearing for a while to get cigarettes, food, or drugs, though it didn't seem like heroin. We knew enough about heroin addicts to tell it wasn't that. On the second night, all the boys were asleep, and I was exhausted. I hadn't slept much and had barely taken my eyes off the man. Late into the night, I noticed the men whispering among themselves. Then, they did some of the most vile things I've ever seen, but I didn't look away. I wasn't focused on them. I was watching the black metal glints barely visible beneath their trousers. I was hoping for a better look, hoping to confirm what I already knew. They weren't carrying fake guns. Those were real. The only thing that seemed to unsettle the men was one of my friends. She was tall, with thick, curly dyed red hair. She had the same kind of Glasgow smile scars on her face as the man outside. But she also had triangles tattooed above and below her eyes, giving her a clownish appearance. The minions looked confused most of the time, like they weren't all there. But the man, the one with the Glasgow smile, was different. He was aware, lucid even, but he wouldn't look at her, not once. He glanced everywhere else but her face. On the fourth day, at around 7 p.m., we heard police sirens. We looked at each other, wondering if one of us had secretly called the police. But the police weren't there for us. They were there for a house down the road, known in the neighborhood as the pharmacy. Riot vans and armed officers were raiding the place. The minions took off running as soon as they heard the sirens. But the man with the Glasgow smile hesitated. Everyone else had turned to watch the commotion at the front of the house, but I kept my eyes on him. He smiled at me, pulled out a gun, and pointed it at me through the glass door. He mimed shooting it, mouthing the word pew before taking off into the night. We never saw him again. The men never came back, and they never hung around the area after that. And thank God we never went outside to confront him. Like I said, I know a fake gun when I see one, and I know a real one, too. There will be two stories here. The first one's super creepy and the second one more sad and more of an explanation as to why I no longer participate. I want to preface this all by saying, I grew up seeing ghosts, so the whole topic of spirits wasn't new to me. However, I was so scared by them that around the time I was on 7 or 8, when the energetic system starts to be solely individualized, I trained my brain to not see them anymore. I never talked about it with friends as my family never believed me, so I assumed they wouldn't either. Story 1. The Halloween Incident. This story takes us back to the 2000s when I was a little girl celebrating my friend's birthday. Her birthday always fell around Halloween, so she would have a spooky themed party every year. She often mentioned how her basement felt eerie and how she hated being down there alone. That Halloween, around 10 of us girls were invited for a sleepover. Naturally, a group of 10-year-olds on Halloween night wasn't going to settle for sleeping in bedrooms. So, her mom and grandma set up the basement for us. We played some of those weird party games like light as a feather or stiff as a board. I was the only one who levitated, and I still remember opening my eyes and almost touching the ceiling. It was creepy. As some of us got tired, someone suggested using a Ouija board. A few girls were too scared to participate, but the rest of us started asking innocent questions. Who is the birthday girl going to marry? How old will we be when we have kids? Then, I asked a question about myself, and the board simply replied, dead. That spooked a lot of us. Right after, one of the girls screamed and claimed to see something in the mirror behind me. That was enough for us to stop playing. For a while. A few hours later, when most of the girls had fallen asleep, 3 of us, including the birthday girl, were still awake and curious. We couldn't shake the feeling of whether the board had been real or just a prank. So, we decided to try again, thinking it would be better since the other girls didn't want to play. It was close to 3 a.m., the witching hour, as we had heard. Remember, we were only about 10 or 11 and had no idea what we were doing. We asked the board to give us a sign. We made a strange request at 3:15 a.m. We wanted the girl who saw something in the mirror earlier to wake up and say something while looking into the mirror. I can't remember exactly what we asked her to say, but I know we all agreed. We said goodbye to the board and put it away. Then, we sat waiting for the impossible to happen. At exactly 3:15 a.m., according to the basement's old grandfather clock, which still worked despite not ringing anymore, the girl suddenly shot up from her sleep, turned towards the mirror, and whispered the exact words we asked her to say. She then fell back onto her pillow like nothing had happened. The rest of the girls slept soundly, not moving an inch. We were frozen in fear. None of us slept until the sun came up, which in October, in the Midwest, is pretty late. We probably got about 3 hours of sleep that night, tops. That experience was my first with a Ouija board, and it changed how I viewed spirits forever. To this day, I feel guilty for essentially asking one of my friends to be possessed. Needless to say, never mess around with things you don't understand. Story 2. The Cheer Squad Incident. Nearly a decade after that first experience, I was a senior in high school. One of my teammates on the cheer squad invited us all over to celebrate her birthday. Little did I know, she had a Ouija board, and when she brought it out, I immediately said it was a bad idea. Her grandma had recently passed, and she was desperate to contact her. I tried to explain to her that even if she reached out, we couldn't be sure it would actually be her grandma coming through. I insisted that she follow the rules, always say goodbye, and put a salt circle around the board to keep whatever we contacted contained. She promised to only try twice, and then she put it away. The girls rotated through, trying the board at least 4 times, but nothing happened. They all laughed at me, mocking how scared I had been. Some of them knew about my past experience with the Ouija board, and they teased me for being paranoid. Irritated, I said, "Fine, I'll do it, and I'll prove to you that it's real." I sat down with the birthday girl and 2 other girls from my class. We placed our fingers on the planchette, circled 3 times, and I asked who we were talking to. For the first time that night, the planchette moved. The 2 girls with me were skeptics. They thought I was moving it on purpose, but the information that came through was stuff I didn't know. The planchette spelled out JR. None of us knew who that could be. We asked why this spirit was here, and it replied, "Friend." Confused, we asked for clarification. Again, the board said JR. Finally, one of the girls blurted out, "Is this Jonathan Raman?" The planchette immediately moved to yes. The girls were stunned. Jonathan Raman had been a classmate a year above me. He was a football player who tragically died during our sophomore year. He had come home late from a party, and rather than waking his parents, he decided to sleep in his car, which was left running in the garage. He died from carbon monoxide poisoning. His death devastated our school, especially his friends. The two girls were shocked and started questioning the board. They asked what Jonathan's football number had been. The planchette moved to two numbers, both of which matched. Then they asked about the color of his car. The planchette spelled out red, which was true. They grew more frantic, asking who Jonathan's best friend was. The planchette spelled out a name, and it was spot on. These were details I couldn't have known. Jonathan and I were not close. We shared mutual friends, but I had never spoken to him. Yet, here I was, channeling what appeared to be his spirit. The girls freaked out. They didn't even say goodbye. They flung the board at me and accused me of lying. They thought I had been moving the planchette the whole time. They were crying and yelling at me, and it made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. The entire cheer squad went silent. I was the captain and had known most of these girls for 3 years. But after that night, many of them refused to speak to me for weeks. Some of them thought I was crazy, while others saw me as disgusting for what they believed was impersonating a dead classmate. Only a few understood that I wouldn't have known all those details about Jonathan. I truly believe it was his spirit coming through, though I can't discount the possibility that spirits can pretend to be someone else. I don't use Ouija boards anymore. You never really know who you're contacting, or worse, who you might anger. However, these experiences have guided me towards becoming an energy reader and medium. Now, I connect with the spiritual realm in a much safer and more controlled way.